Hoping that the whole makes sense, by So Do Roses. Chapter 2. Roman was laughing, his head thrown back in mirth. His hand reached out to shove the rider beside him. Roman watched, like he was seeing through his eyes from a long tunnel. It was him, and yet not him, familiar and totally alien at once. He wore the same silvery shirt he'd woken up in the day the prince was gone, a shining sword at his hip, and he could feel his face pulled up into a sharp and too taut grin. He overbalanced, nearly falling out of the saddle, but he righted himself before he could faceplant in the dirt. His horse shifted sideways, irritated. "Easy," he said, patting the horse's mane. His body turned, which was disorienting for Roman on the inside, pinned and powerless to watch the memory through this stranger's eyes. On his own horse, next to Roman, was the Serpent King, wearing black velvet and shining gold, his gaze heavy. "Careful, Sir Roman," he said. "I might think you dissatisfied with my company, the way you carry on with Belladonna." Roman's face pulled up into an even wider grin, instantly reaching for the king's hand, cradling it and bringing it to his lips. "Who could ever grow weary of you?" he spoke, with his lips pressed to the back of the king's hand. "My love knows no ending, my king." His reward was an eye roll, but still an undeniably pleased one. The horses immediately in front of them came to a sudden stop, shuffling, and the leading knights let out peals of laughter. "Look what we have!" cried one. "This should be fun." The king cleared his throat, and the two knights moved aside. The king's horse stepped forward, and Roman's followed. In between the trees was a group of humans Roman didn't recognize. From the look of their things, they were camping, probably from a city far enough away to have never heard the warnings about Wickhills. 2 adults, the parents maybe, and a gaggle of children ranging from elementary school to Roman's own age. The Serpent King tutted. "Is there a reason you trespass in my kingdom? Or did you merely decide you felt like dying today?" he said, bored. Roman pulled a knife out of his boot and began to pick his nails. "Please, we didn't know," said the mother. "Well, that's hardly an excuse." The king waved his hand as if to swat away her explanation. "I suppose it works out," he said, turning to Roman and grinning. "Haven't given the abomination much to play with lately. These should keep it occupied." "No," said Roman. The king raised an eyebrow, face turning carefully blank. "No?" Roman smiled at him. "Not really much of a punishment, is it?" said Roman. "They'd go senseless well before they really regretted it." The king shrugged. "Fair, Sir Roman. Did you have an alternative?" Roman looked down at the humans over the top of his horse's head. "Trees?" he offered. "They want to spend time in our woods so bad. Let them be part of it, and they can stay here until some other mortal recognizes their true nature." Belladonna cackled next to him. "That could take decades," she said. Roman shrugged, laughing. "Is that my problem? And it's a nice clearing. I can see why they picked it. Who wouldn't want to spend a few decades here?" The king actually smiled then. "Trees it is then, darling. A good choice." "Wait, please!" "Rest well," said Roman brightly. He wiggled his fingers in a mockery of a goodbye as the Serpent King waved a hand. The air split with terrified screams and the sound of crunching bone and wood. Their bodies twisted and stretched, their arms extended to the sky, their bodies thickening to trunks and their skin shriveling into bark. Roman watched, still smiling, until the screams petered off and the new trees stood silent, the twisted faces of the humans barely recognizable in the whirls of the wood. "Huh," he said, smile falling slightly. "They're ugly." The Serpent King laughed. "Last time it was animals, and you complained they weren't distinctive enough. You're never satisfied, are you?" he said. "Don't worry, darling. I'll make you as many pretty trees as you like." Roman perked up, leaning forward and smirking brazenly. "I wouldn't say I'm never satisfied," he purred. The Serpent King rolled his eyes once more, but he did lean in, muttering as he shook his head. "Presumptuous thing," he grumbled. "Is it presumptuous when I know you want to kiss me anyway?" Roman said lightly. "Only if you ask nicely." Roman pouted. "Please kiss me," he whined. The king gave him a perfunctory peck, but before he could retreat, Roman threaded his fingers into the king's hair and pulled him back, ignoring the obnoxious crowing around them and pressing forward. The king bit his lip reproachfully, and Roman huffed in response. "You seem fairly eager now," the king muttered smugly against Roman's mouth, which was about the time that the fog cleared from Roman's head, and he realized that this was very much no longer a memory. He'd shifted onto his knees, his arms looped tightly around the king's shoulders. The king, for his part, was smiling lazily, his hands resting on Roman's waist, his fingers just under the hem of Roman's shirt. "Did you enjoy the memory?" he taunted. Roman yanked his hands back from around the king's neck, horrified, but all the king did in response was slide his hand further around Roman, under his shirt, and manhandle him until Roman was sitting fully in his lap, knees on either side of his hips. The fact that Roman could feel the muscle memory in this position made him want to throw up. "Did you have any other questions?" the king said, drawing his free hand through Roman's hair. "I'd be happy to let you in on more memories. I have some particular favorites." Roman couldn't hold back the first sob, but he did manage to swallow the lump in his throat before he really started crying. "Poor darling," the king soothed, but the effect was somewhat lost by the gleeful expression on his face. "No questions, then?" he said. "We can occupy ourselves in a variety of other ways." Roman squeezed his eyes shut, unable to keep looking at the king's face, but all that did was bring the nightmarish memory back into razor-sharp clarity, his own voice calling for the torture of an innocent family, his lack of surprise at the mention of the monster. The monster. The thing in the school this morning. It belonged to the king. "What?" he started. Roman was having trouble getting words out around the panicked pressure in his ribs, which increased with every back-and-forth swipe of the king's fingers on his skin, but the king only smiled serenely. "What?" he asked. "Why did—" Roman cleared his throat, trying to find inside of him whatever part of Knight Roman that had made him sound so confident in that memory. "Why did you set the monster on the school?" he said. And, even though it took some effort to do it without recoiling, he laid his hands back around the king's neck. But the king only tilted his head, confused. "What are you talking about?" he laughed. Roman hesitated. "The creature, your creature, this morning. You sent it to the school." The king laughed again, incredulous. "You must be confused, darling," he said. "I didn't send it anywhere. It's sleeping, somewhere in the woods." Roman's heart seized. "I was there," insisted Roman. "It was at the school. There was riot. What are you— People are in the hospital!" The king shrugged. "You know how humans are," he said. "They kill each other all the time. They were probably bored." Roman flinched at the way the king said humans like he wasn't talking to one, but there were more important topics at hand than the fact that Roman might secretly be a monster. "That thing was at my school," repeated Roman, and there must have been something of Knight Roman in him, because he had definitely just shouted at the Serpent King. The king rolled his eyes, moving one hand from Roman's waist up to his cheek. "I assure you," he said irritably, "you must be confused. I did not set that abomination on your little human town." He drew the hand back, making a fist and holding it in front of Roman. "This ring," he said, tilting his head to the plain, matte-white band around his middle finger, "is what controls the cursed thing, and it has not left my hand in decades. I did not send it to the school, and it would not have gone anywhere or done anything without my orders." He was wrong, Roman realized with dawning horror. But if he couldn't be lying, then what? The monster had been at the school, but the Serpent King had no idea, and if the king hadn't sent it, the monster had come of its own accord, without an order. Somehow, the king had lost control of it, which was just about the worst-case scenario. "Okay," he said, because he knew there was no use trying to convince the king he was wrong when he was so adamant. And even if Roman did manage to persuade him, the king probably wouldn't even care. Roman must have been quiet for longer than he thought, because the Serpent King seemed to have checked out of the conversation completely. Instead, he was winding strands of Roman's hair around his fingers one at a time. He drew a line down the side of Roman's neck, and Roman flinched. He knew the best way to keep the king talking would be to play along, but he couldn't help it. He wanted to be as far away from the king as physically possible, as quickly as possible. The king sighed, exasperated. "This is almost starting to get old," he said, bored. "You usually have a lot more," he huffed, "spirit." He sighed when he placed his hand on the side of Roman's throat, leaning in as if to kiss him again, and when Roman's whole body went rigid, the king raised his eyebrows as if to indicate that exact thing. "You aren't even fighting. You're just cowering. It's a little pathetic, darling." Some bizarre combination of hot embarrassment and a near-desperate desire to be accommodating and pleasant and "don't let him go, stay here, don't leave." Luckily, thought the more rational part of Roman's brain, the king couldn't actually read his mind. He pushed Roman off of him, standing and then taking Roman's hand again. He led him back over to the curtain and pushed him slightly. "Go, be merry, so on and so forth," the king drawled. "Enjoy the revel. When you've slept, come back to me, and I'll see about maybe getting you put back together. You're really not much fun like this at all." He pushed Roman again, and Roman stumbled through the fabric. The roaring noise of the revel came back all at once, and the king gave a nasty smile. He turned away, dropping the curtain, and Roman was supremely grateful he'd done so before he could see Roman yank back the hand that had tried to follow him. "How'd it go, charming?" Roman recoiled. The knight, not the same one from before, but Belladonna, from the memory, was watching him with barely disguised glee. "You aren't supposed to be here," she said, sing-song, "and showing up with the little cuckoo bird. There's better ways to make your liege jealous, you know, that don't involve getting the poor changeling executed." When Roman's only response was an expression of abject horror, she tilted her head a little bit. "What?" she said. "I thought you liked him." She moved to shove him lightly, but Roman flinched out of her reach. She jerked away from him, a little stunned. "Oh," she said. "You're—" Roman nodded vigorously. "Ah," she said, "my mistake. Forget what I said about executing the changeling. I don't think the king's quite as, She waved a hand around as if grasping for a word, then snapped as she seemed to find it. "Possessive of you, as he is of our Roman. Could be totally fine." She gave him a sunny smile and patted his arm, like she genuinely thought that was a comforting thing to say, and walked off. Which was good, because Roman was pretty sure if he'd tried to respond, he would have thrown up. He'd known all along that coming here would be putting himself in danger. It hadn't occurred to him it would drag Logan into it as well. Roman picked his way through the clearing, desperately trying to dodge anyone who looked like they might be about to be friendly. He mostly succeeded, but a few got to him, clapping him on the back and trying to drag him into discussions that didn't make sense, but were just familiar enough to make him feel like he was supposed to know what to say. It was so similar to the way the strange girl's voice back in the woods had sounded. Did she know Knight Roman then? Why was she so desperate to hide this from him? He shook his head and extricated himself from the latest of these mind-numbingly frustrating conversations. He was getting frantic. Where was Logan? He wouldn't have left, but Roman didn't see him anywhere. Cool fingers suddenly looped around his wrist and yanked. Roman didn't have enough time to panic before he'd already been dragged to the edge of a clearing and behind a tree. He blinked, looking down at Logan's stormy, terrified expression. "What did he do to you?" Logan demanded. Roman had had a very long evening, and an even longer week. So really, even if it was pretty embarrassing, he didn't think anyone could really blame him for bursting into tears. Logan stared as Roman ducked behind the curtain, and he didn't think he'd ever been so terror-stricken in his life. It was taking a significant amount of restraint to not barge across the clearing and through that curtain anyway. It was only the knowledge that, as weak a fae as he was, and as little control as he had over his magic anyway, he was more likely to get both himself and Roman killed than manage anything actually helpful. His skin itched. It It always did at these things. Logan wasn't quite sure, but he theorized that maybe the proximity to magic and other fae had a tendency to bring certain tendencies closer to the surface. He'd growled, for goodness sake, like some kind of animal. At the time, he'd been too furious to care, but now that Roman was hopelessly out of reach of whatever base territorial instinct had possessed Logan, he was only profoundly embarrassed. Maybe. He might also be a little afraid. Logan tried to give the people he loved as few opportunities as possible to remember he was a monster, but that had been a pretty spectacular slip. "Hello, Raindrop," Logan sneered. "Goodbye, Irwin," he replied, not waiting for her to respond before he started walking resolutely away. Irwin had long since stopped being irritated by Logan's distaste of her or his refusal to call her anything but her given name. Now she only found him amusing. Logan actually preferred her angry. "I see you brought a friend," she said, following close behind him. Logan's vision flashed red with fury, and he barely restrained himself from launching at her. As it was, his shoulders only twitched. She laughed, high and cold and painfully condescending. Logan considered shoving her into the fire. There was a possibility the other fae might find it funny. Snow melt making someone else melt. Logan cringed. That was another unsavory thing these revels brought out in him, an inclination to contemplate murder with much less moral outrage than was strictly acceptable. Acceptable for a human, anyway. "You know," she taunted, "I didn't actually know you were fond of that particular mortal." Logan whirled on her, and this time he couldn't restrain the guttural noise of sheer rage that bubbled up in his throat, or the swipe he took and missed at her face. "Leave him alone!" She leaned out of his reach effortlessly, actually giggling. "Or what?" she said. "What will you do, boy? Growl at me?" Logan's face flushed, mortified. "You probably need to find a replacement for him anyway," she said, waving her hand. Her voice was light, but the smile on her face was vicious and mocking. "I don't think the Serpent King shares very well." Logan's stomach felt like it froze solid. "What the hell does that mean?" "Ask your little friend," she said primly. "Careful, though. You might not like the answer." She gestured toward the fire, and Roman was there next to it, clearly trying to extricate himself from the knot of fae around him. Logan didn't even look back at Irwin, moving as quickly as he could without running. Roman startled when Logan grabbed him, but Logan's first and most pressing concern was getting Roman as far away from the crowd as possible. Once at the edge of the clearing, Logan pulled him behind a tree. It was poor cover, and an even poorer shield, but it would have to do. "What did he do to you?" Logan demanded. There was a half-second of silence in which Roman looked down at Logan, a little stunned. And then his face crumpled, and he started sobbing. Roman was the taller of the two of them, but it didn't matter at this moment. He slumped forward, hiding his face in Logan's neck, his arms tight around Logan's ribs and hands scrabbling desperately at the back of Logan's shirt. After a moment of confused hesitation, Logan gently put his arms around Roman's shoulders, tugging softly, pulling him down until they were both sitting on the forest floor, Logan's back against the tree. Roman's sobs didn't even pause. "It's Logan's words stuttered, and his arms tensed around Roman in frustration. Normally, okay was vague enough that Logan could say it regardless of the actual state of the situation. But whatever was happening now, it was obviously not okay. "Roman," Logan said, helpless. He laid one hand on top of Roman's head. Roman's breath was coming in stuttering gasps against Logan's neck. "It will..." Logan's throat tightened, but he concentrated, furious, willing himself to believe it, like he could make it be true out of sheer tenacity. "It will be okay," he said, deliberate and precise. Roman huffed. It may have been a laugh, but it also could have been another hiccuping sob. Either way, he seemed to be calming down. Logan laid his head on top of Roman's. Humming was comforting, wasn't it? Logan could hum. He tried, but the noise he ended up making was less of a hum and more of an inhuman rumbling noise. He cut it off, flushing with embarrassment, but Roman either hadn't noticed or didn't care, which was a relief either way. Roman's cries continued to peter off until he was only breathing a little heavier than normal. Slowly, he sat up, and Logan let him go, even though every cell in his body hated it. "Sorry," said Roman thickly. Logan shook his head firmly. "Please do not apologize for being distressed," he said. He hesitated, fiddling with the hem of his shirt. On the one hand, he certainly didn't want to press Roman when he was this upset. On the other, Logan's head was filling with a variety of utterly enraging potential explanations for Roman's weeping, and his pulse was starting to roar in his ears. "Are you hurt?" he blurted desperately. Roman laughed shortly, a little hysterical. "Not physically, no." The statement did nothing to mitigate the rapidly increasing boiling in Logan's blood. "I'll kill him. What did he do to you? I swear it, I'll kill him." Logan bit his tongue so hard he tasted blood. "Roman," he pleaded, "please, tell me what is going on." Roman exhaled shakily. "I can't," he started. "You promised," said Logan. He tried to sound firm, but instead he just sounded incredibly small. "No, I mean..." Roman pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. I can't do it twice," he said. He moved his hands, giving Logan a wobbly smile. "I just can't," he repeated. "I did promise, and I will, just Patton too, okay?" Logan relaxed. That was fair, and very in character. "Very well," he said. "I understand." Roman nodded, pulling up the hem of his shirt and wiping his face. He shivered. "Come on," he said. "I'm freezing. Let's move a bit closer." Logan's comfort evaporated. Move closer to the horde of supernatural beings that is indifferent at best and most likely hostile to both of us? Really? Roman rolled his eyes, and he seemed to be regaining some of his usual bravado. "I didn't mean dive in the middle," he said dryly. Logan gave him an unimpressed look. Roman ignored it, standing up and pulling Logan up with him. He didn't actually get all that much closer, just enough so it wasn't quite so frigid and they could hear faint snatches of conversation. Logan could feel eyes on them where they sat on a rotten falling log. He heard a few quiet strains of that stupid nickname and silently prayed Roman hadn't heard it. No such luck. "Why do they call you that?" Roman asked. "Call me what?" said Logan flatly, hoping Roman would take the hint that he very much did not want to talk about it. "Snowmelt," said Roman. "They keep calling you that." Logan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's a joke," he said wearily. "They are mocking me." Roman kept watching him expectantly, raising one eyebrow. "I am..." Logan tried to figure out how to phrase it. "You are familiar with the concept of winter and summer courts," he said. "Yeah, that's pretty standard folklore curriculum, Niels Boring." Logan's mouth nearly twitched into a smile, but he shook his head, pushing on. "Irwin is winter," he said, "as am I. However, I was born very close to the spring equinox." He gestured to the clearing as a whole. "I am quite possibly the least powerful fae here," Logan sighed. "Pathetically so, I'm told. Barely winter is what Irwin called me once. Hence snowmelt. It stuck." "Well, that's rude," said Roman. Logan couldn't help the brief laugh that blurted out of his mouth. "That is what you took away?" said Logan. "Not that I am near powerless to help you if we get into some kind of disastrous situation, but that the denizens of the forest are unkind to me?" Roman bit the inside of his cheek, clearly trying not to giggle. "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds silly." Music started up, but Logan barely registered it over the swelling of fondness in his chest. He rolled his eyes, unable to keep the tenderness out of his voice. "As always, the arrangement of your priorities astounds me." Roman was silent, and Logan turned to rib him again. It had been a long time since they'd properly bantered. Logan hadn't quite realized just how much he'd missed it, and he found himself eager to keep it going as long as possible. But when he saw Roman's face, he froze. Roman was staring toward the fire, towards the music, towards the dancing, and he was already standing, moving forward. Logan leapt to his feet, planting himself between Roman and the barely forming circle at Logan's back. He grabbed Roman's face, trying to block the movement from his vision. Roman! Roman, listen to me! Roman! Logan realized he was quickly edging toward hysteria, but there were so many Fae here. Roman could step into the circle and easily vanish, and Logan would be powerless to retrieve him. Logan was weak by Fae standards, but he was still much stronger than most humans, so he did have a brief moment of bewilderment when he realized that his attempts to slow Roman down were having little to no effect. But it was quickly drowned out by his mounting panic. Someone stumbled against Logan's back. Logan actually snapped his teeth at her before he could stop himself. Rather than retreat, the Fae seemed delighted by this. She hummed a little laugh. She was smiling, her cheeks bright red, but her mouth closed tight. Logan realized she was intoxicated. She grabbed him by the tie, yanking him down and pressing their mouths together. Logan pulled one hand off of Roman's shirt to shove her away. She pouted, and Logan wiped his mouth. It was sticky, and far more wet than even a particularly sloppy kiss should be. 3 events happened in rapid succession. The faint taste of elderberries bloomed on Logan's tongue when he inhaled, and he realized the Fae girl had tried to force the wine in her mouth down his throat when she kissed him. His stomach seized with panic, and he tried to shove Roman backwards, out of her reach. He was too slow. She pulled Roman down by the back of his neck, and since Roman was already half delirious from the music and the circle, he didn't put up even a token resistance when she opened her mouth. She let him go, and Roman's eyes opened, pupils blown wide as quarters, and he let out an airy, delirious laugh. Logan stared, horrified. Fuck. And that's the end of Hoping That the Whole Makes Sense by So Do Roses.